Okay, so I've rediscovered some of my old solutions um, by having new confrontations. I haven't sort of come across the sort of the borderline temperament for quite some time. So I guess it's good that I've had a refresher because it allows me to, I think, more effectively work out what the ideological confrontation is to dealing with this on an ideological level, on a political level. So this is basically going to be a kind of a political primer, just to sort of put some issues in order and to show an effective way of arguing against identity politics, and to describe the ways that it creates a depraved moral corruption and how it facilitates real corruption and state corruption, government corruption, and political unaccountability in general. So that's what I'm going to be going into. So essentially, what I'm suggesting as well, it was sort of implied in what I've just laid down, is that the borderline personality disorder is indistinguishable from the ideology. And let me just sort of explain why this is so. So essentially, I'm not going to go that. I'm going to probably elaborate on the personality disorder at some point, but uh, the basic. So I just wrote a few comments on this. So actually, let me just read that out. This makes the recording sound disjointed, but anyway, yeah. So this probably is going to have to be edited down if someone wants it to be neat. And okay, so someone posted on a history forum a question like, was Hitler schizoid? Did he have a schizoid personality disorder? And so I just gave a kind of opening shot, sort of vaguely talking about this. Okay, I'm just going to read all my replies, even though, yeah, it would be much better if I actually planned out my recordings and what I was going to say. But anyway, sorry for that. Man, you have to learn about psychology deeply before attempting this kind of thing. He was a species of enlightened borderline personality disorder. He found a way to package it into identitarian ideology. It's how feminists use the narrative to justify their passive-aggressive form of projection. Everything the Nazis complained about, they basically did themselves. Through the justification of the state's welfare, the enemy is there to remind you of why you are right, while how you act is rebranded by the new labels and semantics to fit with the latest pronouncement. It's like Twitter and CNN, the mob and the spin doctors. There are no facts, just optics and framing. If you ever talk to an SJW, that's exactly what fascists were like. Some of the academics are literally the same personality style as Hitler. Just, okay, and then I basically said, just check out Ikile or Achille Mbemba. Sorry, because I found his name later on. I just referred to him as the Francophone black professor in South Africa. But yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. The exact same emotional range of rhetorical oratory. Just find some of his lectures where he is talking to an all-black university audience versus the lectures he gives overseas, and you see the kind of manipulation that the spirit of the Führer wishes to mold and father the cause of National Socialist Revolution. They only want to serve the downtrodden identity. They only want to feed it social justice. I'm sort of showing the kind of infantilism that politics is sort of molded into. Um, and then I said, I have a YouTube channel where I heavily discuss personality disorders and political ideology and cultural commentary if you're interested in more of my analysis. And then a whole lot of people disparaged me. And then I just said, this is a very complex subject matter. This is why I referenced my YouTube. The ideology itself is the personality disorder. The reason why borderline personality disorder is exploding or increasing today is because identity, an ideological component, merges with the psyche's self-portrait. which impinges on the character development of a person and locking it into a style of character expression. The ideology which mediates reality through identity categories within a narrative within a narrative generating an absolute sense of why everything is anticipated or why anything is expected, creates a brittle sense of rationalized alignment of all facts, which is very easily leveraged in a cherry-picked way. How the world works is prone to spin doctoring because conserving the absolute efficacy of the why narrative is paramount to validating the self-portrait, which has been imbued by the ideological identity, and what's come along with that ideological identity are the wider trappings of the ideology, enforcing a sort of a complaint of rationalized sympathy that is projected onto reality. So the ideology implies this demand of sympathy to the identity reduction and the identity simplification of everything. And that generalization becomes paramount before anything, before even looking at how successful the ideology is at making people's lives better. What it instead is paramount is that reduction, is that generalization, is more important that is vindicated than actually delivering the goods, actually making people's lives better and developing or increasing things. So the pride of the identity and the identitarian racialist ethos and conception of society and reduction of the self and this is so a part of the self-portrait that essentially, I mean, this is why it's totalitarian, and this is why it's prone to so much cognitive dissonance and projection. So whenever you're talking to one of these people, they have some crazy sort of vague understanding that everyone has their subjective truth, and and it's and then because they sort of conglomerated into the lived experience of a generalization, they sort of have a and then within a kind of canonical historical narrative that lived experience can sort of project onto the present context, they can sort of import past moral wrongs and project them onto okay, now I don't know if my recording is being recorded. Okay, well, sorry, there was a phone call. Okay, anyway, okay, I've got okay, I kind of went off on a tangent there. Let me just go back to my recording. So because I went on okay, so when I said is paramount to the validating the self-portrait that has been imbued with the ideological identity and its implication of projection in some sense of more of the ideological structures. Ideological belief has crossed over into psychology. This is why the Mayans sacrificed people like crazy to try fix the climate crisis and make the sun rise each day. And it's why there is no way to hold politicians accountable on the identitarian left for how they perform and managing how the world really works, because they can just virtue signal as to why their disastrous policy is serving the interest of the identity and the brittle identitarian narrative. A narrative which is pushed by the one ideology state apparatus, the mainstream media. So elites can enjoy virtue signaling their way out of any responsibility in the shadow perversion of democracy, which can't function without a free press, because it's been captured by the borderline disordered mob. This culture is the Nuremberg rallies era that we are reliving through. South African politicians plugging into the identity politics of George Floyd such great cover for their persistent corruption and descent into fascism under the guise of social justice, which has literally been mistranslated to mean its opposite, using race as a proxy for targeting disadvantaged people, thus facilitating black elite plutocracy, impossible for the blame not to be diverted into the identitarian narrative, which is a hysteria over the oversimplified narrative. Okay, I actually had a semicolon there. Semicolon. Hysteria over the oversimplified narrative is because it only functions through generalizing about identity, thus facilitating cherry-picked emblems both to prove the narrative and to conceal the morally and practically corrupt solutions in inverted commas, in scare quotes, because their solution is not a solution. It is just more sabotage. And then when it fails, they can just use more cherry-picked examples to prove their general narrative. And like, when does it ever meet how reality actually works? It doesn't have to, because they are essentially just plugging directly into people's emotional sense of their self-portrait, uh, which has to be tended to by the political environment and by this form of totalitarian politics, um, which is interwoven into the kind of into the identity narrative, into the identity mythology in some sense, and it's indistinguishable from any kind of fascism. It's got a slightly different story to blood and soil. It's basically, I mean, in some sense, it's because blood and soil was always a kind of metaphor for this kind of political culture. So it's not even that different, because in some sense, the container, the actual, was just an excuse. Um, hmm. Okay, yeah. So, okay, now I've sort of gone off. Let me just try to simplify this while talking now. So this probably doesn't come through as clearly when I'm reading something. So the best way to sort of ground this sort of stuff is to look at this why and how sort of dichotomy, which is a kind of an artificial dichotomy which is being imposed by identity politics, where they think they've got a handle on why. They've got in a narrative that tells them why the sun rises, why anything should be anticipated. And if something doesn't fit the script of why something should happen, then it's committing social injustice or something like that. It's committing a crime against an identity. It's not being sensitive to the identity. So they've got this very simplified reduction of reality, which they can project on reality whenever they so wish, in order to uh, feel like their anticipations and their expectations will just be perfectly, or should be perfectly catered to and pandered to. And essentially, that relationship between the adherent and the political realm is the growing development of the Führer principle, is that politics should provide security to entrench that why narrative, that absolute why narrative, which is essentially at the cost of how things are understood. So the Führer is meant to understand how everything works and secretly just make sure that the why narrative is satisfied, is made complete in some sense, or perfected, or kept perfect, and so it can be, it can continue to support that person's essentially histrionic um, engagement with their surroundings. And generally, the problem with this kind of way of thinking is that life doesn't function like that. Psychology doesn't even function like that. It's fundamentally insane and pathological. It's fundamentally disorientated. It's dislocated so far from reality. And the only way, and if you've ever been around a borderline personality disordered person, you know this. They are always trying to weave your integrity as the basis of their discomfort. So it's like it's on you that you haven't done something good enough. It's always being leveraged against you. It's like a one-way mirror. they're allowed to look inside of you and label what's happening inside of you. But if you say anything back to them, they say, oh, you're just projecting uh, yourself against I'm just a mirror of what's going on inside of you. So anything that you have to say is just all about you. It's got nothing to do with me. It's this weird kind of hypocritical solipsism and sort of autistic uh, self-referencing, so, and because they've got this why story, and they can be like, well, you're stupid because you haven't discovered the why story yet, so you're not actually, trying to talk the same language as me because you haven't already relented yourself into this new kind of way of simplifying everything. So you've got that kind of level of cognitive dissonance, which essentially throws how anything functions under the bus, how reality functions, how any. So this is why they can't solve complex problems, because in their worldview there are no such things as complex problems. Um, Complex problems are solved by taking hostages and then getting someone to take responsibility for cleaning up the mess and doing all the complex things behind the scenes. And this is why they're so prone to dehumanizing and you know uh, frankly they're fine with rationalizing mass murder, essentially. Kill all the people who disagree, kill all the people who aren't getting with the program. This is the because it's so woven into their personality structure, into their self-portrait. And so they have developed as an army of psychopaths trying to find a political voice that will uh, uh, um, instantiate their virtue and will guard their virtue for them as part of sort of the why piece of the puzzle that will keep their idealism alive. Now, the problem with this idealism is that essentially the manipulation that it allows its adherents to leverage essentially is all at the expense of how anything works. And when you've got people who are addicted to this kind of thinking about reality, essentially they are the best useful idiots for oligarchs and plutocrats. So in South Africa, essentially, you can say that we've got white elites that are rich in some sense, but you've also got black elites that are rich for a very bad reason. I mean, not all black elites are rich for this bad reason, but a lot of black elites are rich because of corruption. And that corruption essentially is undetectable because of identity politics. You cannot go after it. You cannot name it. And essentially, in some sense, all forms of corruption in some sense are going to exist to some degree. But this is problematic because it's baked into the corruption of the law, which is baked into this moral corruption, which is essentially only permitted because of this corruption of the political arena itself, that we have lost the liberal character of our society. We don't have liberal politics anymore. We don't have democracy anymore. We have a one ideology state because of this ideology. If you don't have a free press, if you don't have if you can't have a democracy if you don't have journalists actually interrogating reality and making sense of the world. And we don't have any of that, because instead we have people pushing the identitarian narrative and the identitarian categorization of all facts, and this brittle form of rationalism, which essentially is self-selecting in the stories that it publishes. It's self-selecting in the questions that it asks, because it has to promote the narrative. It has to promote the simplified, generalized reduction of everything according to, to facilitate making race the proxy for targeting disadvantage. And that generalization right there is exactly how corruption takes place in government. That is what facilitates the destabilization of market forces, which would naturally precipitate development and growth. It's the level of pervasive systemic sabotage. It's ironic because they complain about systemic oppression, but they are the ones generating systemic oppression. If they just if you want to judge capitalism, how about you give it a shot? How about you actually give it an opportunity before you essentially do your stealing and corruption and destabilization and essentially the destruction of all kind of organic and authentic development and growth. Once you remove that, and then you say, well, the reason why it doesn't work is because capitalism doesn't work. I mean, it's crazy. This is the kind of I mean, and you get professors all over the world who say crazy shit like this, like that Indian Marxist professor who said that South Africa was an example of how the free market doesn't function. I mean, please, if you know anything about the internal politics of South Africa, you know that essentially it's a history of this deep corruption and ideological hypocrisy and this two-faced, sort of the second, I mean, the corruption of the political economy, essentially. Um, but I mean, in some sense, it's because, I mean, in some sense, the people must hold themselves accountable. It's because culture fell for this. I mean, you could say as well that certain academics have been pushing this. They have been corrupting the education system. They've been indoctrinating people. This is essentially everyone has become an intersectional feminist in some sense. I mean, this is all based on feminism. That's where this, which already had the kind of the semblance of the Nazi conception of society and worldview. They saw themselves as the downtrodden Aryans after the First World War. That's how feminists see themselves. That's how they see women. And their solution essentially is to do what the Aryans did, or what the Germans did with Aryan studies in Weimar Germany, and that's where we are culturally, essentially. But it's obviously it's metastasized and it's grown. After moving from feminism to the gay pride thing, that sort of just pride, the word pride, already essentially established and showed people that identity can be your national identity in some sense, and you can try to tap into real politics through the generalization of identity. Obviously, nations themselves in some sense are very ethically efficient, because although nationalism itself is its own generalization, it's somewhat justifiable because you have a vote within your nation. You don't have a vote over other nations. So it's very compact in that it doesn't matter if people within your nation have the wrong view about matters that occur overseas, because you don't get a vote overseas. So in some sense, it really structures the level of accountability and responsibility. And the idea is that, fix your own problems first in some sense. Make sure that your country is running effectively and truthfully, and it doesn't fall prey to oligarchical political suppression and control and things like that. But as part of the identity politics thing, is to make the problem so big that it's just always an emergency. It always requires a hysterical, emotional, knee-jerk response, in the same way that borderlines will create semantic bullshit just to kind of change and manipulate the circumstance so that they can continue to say, yes, well, this is why I'm in the right and I can never be wrong. And they can continue to sweep how things work under the carpet. And they can just sort of, just keep on moving along and keep on creating diversions and keep on redirecting pressure from essentially their nonsense, from their constant redefinition of words and their constant adaptation of meaning to fit their why absolutism in some sense, which is in the full ideological sense, it is the ideological machination. It is the ideological psychological machine that is manifesting. And so we've had the destruction of words. We've had the destruction of racism is, I mean, what is called racism is actually non-racialism to a large extent. I mean, not obviously there are things that are also just racist, but and a lot of those things come under the banner of anti-racism. So these so-called anti-racists that call people racist are attacking non-racialists while they themselves promulgate the most disgusting form of racism that underpins an unaccountable political system that is just so corrupt and so totalitarian, and frankly escalating in its fascism, escalating in its destruction of the rule of law, as it has to be more and more encroached upon by dealing with all issues through the characterization or through the categorization of identity by the conceptual categories of identity, and having to conform a system of law and legal theory that comports to that. And this is why you get the kind of the brittle legal positivism, where essentially democracy is 50% plus one vote. That's all we need, and we can do whatever the fuck we want. And we can reinterpret the Constitution however we want. And we can, and that is exactly what they've done with secondary legislation. They have twisted the words of the Constitution, which you understand that the Constitution of South Africa talks about equality, and in some sense there are two senses of equality. There's some sense in which equality has already been achieved because it's equality before the law, and in some sense it's actually been contravened because the law itself is a representation of violating the equality clauses. But in the progressive sense of equality, which is described in the Constitution, in that sense, equality can never be achieved. In that sense, equality can only be enhanced. Okay? So if you're trying to enhance equality, how do you do that intelligently? How do you do that at all? How is in some sense the only way to do that is you have to have an intelligent way of having policy that deals with disadvantage, that has a way of devising some methods or devising some strategies of actually fixing disadvantage or ameliorating disadvantage. And in some sense, that's the only, if it doesn't actually fit that bill, if it doesn't actually quantitatively diminish disadvantage, like actually tackle the disadvantage, not the secondary effects of disadvantage, but if it doesn't actually contract disadvantage in any sense, if it just sort of sustains the disadvantage to make it more comfortable or something like that, that it's not policy that has anything to do with the equality clauses. It's not secondary legislation. And what we have is this disgusting form of racialist confection called the Promotion of Equality Act, which actually leverages a kind of social injustice which it justifies as being anti-racist. And I mean, essentially, that moral corruption is the seed of this disgusting cultural and political perversion, which is what leads us to this never-ending cycle of corruption. And essentially, that sabotage, that destabilization caused by that corruption, just gets recycled and leveraged against the enemies and the scapegoats within the identity category system anyway. So it's a, I mean, it is complicated because it's very hard to. Okay. Anyway, the way to actually, if you were to deal with someone like this politically, it's very difficult, because if you don't actually get into any kind of dialogue, and they will be loath to get into any kind of dialogue because they will essentially just recoil, and then they'll narrate you. They will talk about you from the disembodied, abstracted, hypothetical thing. In some sense, like how I say that they're an army of psychopaths, and then you could say things like you dehumanize your opponents, and then they'll be like, well, look, you're a hypocrite because you just called us an army of psychopaths. And it's like, well, does that actually make me a hypocrite? Does that really? Uh, like, do I not believe that you are an army of psychopaths? So that's hypothetically, I would be a hypocrite, but I actually believe that it is actually true. And they'll be like, oh, well, so do we. Well, I mean, that's neither here nor there. You were just calling me a hypocrite. Um, so it's weird, the kind of those sorts of nuanced asymmetries. It's hard to pick those apart, but essentially, I mean, you have to point it out essentially that they keep on taking it upon themselves to be the chair, to, to be the director, to have the chairmanship over reality. That they are not coming at you and engaging you as equal parties in a debate or in an argument or in an exchange. They are always leveraging that they can see things from the God's eye point of view, that they can see things as to why. They know why you said that. They know why you do anything. And they will not talk about how the world works, how anything works. They will judge you according to their self-styled, insulated, uh, um, frankly, autistic, sort of racism, um, which is complete and subjective unto itself, which needs no accountability to anything else. And so, because it can say, "Oh yes, I'm flouting. I don't have to be responsible to you. I'm not answerable to you." Well, that is how they are not answerable to how the effects of what they do produce devastating consequences. That's the same in vulnerability in some sense. And although it's a convoluted ideological way of doing that, I mean, it functions as a psychopathy. I mean, it is a form of that they can choose to leverage and disorientate and derange reality to such an extent that they are absolutely immune. They cannot be wrong. Well, if you cannot be wrong, then what are you doing? You're not really doing politics. You're doing some kind of strange racial, religious, sort of esotericism. And that's exactly what they are. They leverage this esoteric why. They know why the sun rises. And the sun must be made to rise now for the righteous reason, because it's been rising and shining equally on people of all races. But now, we have to control why things happen within the state in order to redress the injury that has done to a part of the narrative which is hooked into their self-portrait, which is a piece of this why story, why anything should happen or should be allowed to happen or should be expected or anticipated. So, they can't debate over why they believe what it is that they believe. They won't answer. They will, frankly, I mean, it's worth perhaps even asking just to have that on the record. Their disgusting deflections. I mean, you see, it's interesting that the answer to why they believe anything is essentially just an excuse to repeat the narrative. That's all they can do, is they can just repeat the God's eye point of view narrative, where it's like, and then you can just ask them basic, embarrassing questions. How do you know that that's what they were thinking when that happened? How do you know that the effects of that historical event has trickled down into, so they don't believe in trickle down economics, but they believe in trickle down history, like it's amazing, like, because they won't actually understand how the world works and how it functions. They've got their simplified generalized reduction. That's all they need. So they've got a perfect description of cause and effect, and it's based on a generalization. It's based on stereotypes, and you can't get them to stop the stereotype. The stereotype is more important than the effects of their corruption. And this is effectively a mind virus. It's a moral corruption, because they can't actually debate with that proposition. They can't actually make that proposition vulnerable. They need it, because otherwise they can't see reality. They can't navigate anything. They have given their souls to this identity categorization, and the only thing that they demand is they want a Führer, they want a savior of their identity, and they want politics to function in that image. So, that's the kind of mess that we're sort of in culturally. And, to confront it, it is difficult to confront, because they're going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at you. And they do. But it has to be borne out that this is the ideology of unaccountability. I mean, because once they get their spin doctors and their propaganda and already they're doing this with academia. Already they do this with historicizing the present political context, how they project history onto the present. So to continue to delude how anything functions, because their explanation of how these functions is why the identity has this residual emotional pride missing or something like that, and the project to reclaim the identitarian pride becomes the progress, and it has completely hollowed out the constitution. It has completely betrayed it. It has reinterpreted it into its opposite. And so we have now a whole sympathetic intellectual economy and legal theory that facilitates this looming fascistic corruption of the law and inculcation of the corrupt state and the facilitation of it. Will it be challenged? How can it be challenged? I mean, it is hard to sort of find an angle to stand your ground and to make a critique of it. It is hard because you sort of they so quickly rush into throwing the kitchen sink at you that you need to almost find the correct response for all the kinds of mayhem that they try to unleash and threaten and take hostages, when you don't let them essentially uh, uh, um, hold that God's eye point of view, hold that that their moral certitude is the representative of the kind of the canonical point of view. It's because uh, it's so soothing to their army of psychopaths. It's so soothing, the idea that someone is going to take control of it. It is the kind of is interesting because, I mean, I would argue that to a large extent the Trump phenomena is a form of populism that is trying to fight against that kind of oversimplification, that kind of just, in some sense, because civic nationalism is nothing even close to National Socialism. The idea that people are going to compare Trump to Hitler is fucking disgusting. I mean, if anything, Hitler is sort of more like a Churchillian figure. But the idea that you're going to sort of try to interpret civic nationalism just because it has the word nationalism in the name is not even, I mean, in some sense, civic nationalism is the kind of the simplest way to tackle this kind of disgusting, perverted fascist totalitarian politics, rather than having to go through, deconstructing it and looking into its fascistic premises and its you know very unsustainable internal psychological structure. Uh, I mean, I don't think I emphasized it, but I mean, the problem is that even if they win, even if they take over, it's so unsustainable, because the only way to know that you are on the right side of the Y narrative essentially is to be a part of the attack against someone who isn't. And so this is why even in Nazi Germany, even while they were winning the war, you had an escalation in sort of ritual book burnings and ritual, marches against the Jewish conspiracy, because it's a constant state of a sort of civil war, um, to keep the identity nationalism alive in some sense, to keep it clear in people's minds, because it doesn't have it cannot be understood in terms of how it functions. It can only be understood in terms of why it functions. And so you keep on having to invent new ways of deploying how it's relevant or how it's pertinent, because otherwise it's just a kind of, it's an abstract. It fundamentally is an abstract. I mean, it's essentially crafted out of a hypothetical complaint. This is why it's premised on cherry-picked statistical interpretation of reality in society. This is why they use, in some sense, they use statistics in a very dishonest way. Because if you actually looked at the statistics objectively, I think you find that a lot of what they go into, in some sense, is very superficial, and it's focused on essentially escalating the hysteria over the size of the problem, and it's they don't even look at like different ways of solving it, because if you looked at different ways of solving it, you would realize just how devastating and useless their solutions are, and how much they have sabotaged and derailed real progress, which essentially they constantly have to double down on and try to divert the blame for this, and put it onto their identitarian scapegoat of white monopoly capital. So you have this self-fulfilling prophecy of self-agonized, self-defeating, um, it's interesting. It sort of it creates the fuel to make its own fire larger in some sense, until it puts the Führer in power, until it puts someone who is willing to take on this kind of moralizing, and it was disgusting that the opposition in South Africa, the DA, wasted so much time because Musi Maimane was essentially, he bought into this bullshit. He bought into this moral landscape. He was a candidate Führer, essentially. He was trying to pander to the identity. And, he was completely fine with racialized legislation. He was completely fine with using race as a proxy for disadvantage. So he was just going to make himself look like a better paternalistic, identitarian, nationalist than the other ones on offer. Um, and this is the state of politics in South Africa, which is obviously almost probably in a more delicate position than in the rest of the world. But at least perhaps the rest of the world is going through enough of a similar sort of thing that we can sort of, that the narrative can be put together in terms of understanding the depth of depravity of this, of this beastly, ideological totalitarianism, um, and its destruction of liberal values and liberal democracy, which has already taken place in South Africa. So we have to, I mean, before it's sealed, we have to hope that there is space for regeneration, that there is scope for resurrecting the Constitution and the new South Africa, because it has been killed, and it has been killed by these academics, by these politicians, um, by a certain level of complicity by journalists, who are keeping in effect this one ideology state, and who are facilitating essentially, um, the methods. You see, like, they complain about corruption, but they don't complain about the method. They can't complain about the method because they are for the method of racialized legislation. They love giving a platform to that kind of emotional, um, uh, uh, psychopathic, infection that helps to inform the army of psychopaths to invest further into their own self-righteousness. Okay, well, I guess that's about it. I should have focused more, I guess, on how to maybe tackle it on the ground. I mean, you see, the thing is that you can't tackle it. You can't tackle it in a formulaic way. It depends on exactly what part of defense, or how they're manifesting their defense of it, or how they're playing it. Because generally, they've got so many faces to choose from. They've got, their tongue is forked. They've got multiple ways of talking to imply the same sort of why canonical narrative, to deploy the same sort of air of oh yeah, I'm superior, and you have to find a way to crack through that in some sense. um, and I would say that essentially you have to correctly identify each variant of reaction that they use. So if they are very silent, you can say, oh yeah, you see, uh, you know the, they're showing that how the narrative is autistic in that. Okay, obviously that's not what you would say, but essentially you would have to denote how, what you'd have to have a good explanation as to all the different ways in which that they try to continue the argument, or how they win the argument without entering into it. You see, they won't even enter the argument because they can't defend their ideology, because their ideology is corruption. So you keep on calling it corruption, and you keep on saying why it's corruption, and you keep on saying how what they do is wrong, and also why what they do is wrong. And you have to deploy that at different levels, at different in different ways, within the constraints that you have, because they will often leverage the context very keenly, because what they're trying to do is very, very simple. And there's a lot of dishonest ways of doing that same simple thing. So they can use every trick that they have, every context that they have, to throw you off. And in some sense, the only defense you have is consistency, is the overarching coherence in your consistent position, and the clarity of everything that you say when you say it is consistent. And they can try to turn you on your head, because they can just say something else, and they rewrite recent history very quickly. They reframe things very, very quickly. They change their style of argument. They start making this kind of argument, and then they switch, and then they start making a completely different kind of argument because of what you said in between. And then they'll say, no, I was making this all along. And then they'll actually repeat your own words to you while they were making a different strain of the argument. And then they'll impute it to the other, to the argument that they novated to. So they play the sort of this cat and mouse, they play the whack-a-mole thing, and then they reframe history constantly. And it takes a master to some degree to diagnose, and to be able to remember, and you have to be able to look a bit vulnerable. You have to be able to look a bit stupid in some sense, because you know I mean, there are ways of mitigating that in some sense, but it's not going to look like brimstone, and it's not going to be an obvious rebuke. But when you finish your sentence, and when so in after your first three sentences of speaking, it might not look like an obvious rebuke, because you have to almost be a bit confused, because they have actually just left it in a confused state, and so you have to actually honestly represent that. Well, okay, well, now you're saying this, but you were actually saying that, and this is you've confused the matter now. So, like, what are you even arguing for? And don't apologize for your impression. It's like it's better to try to note how they actually changed the topic, how they changed the what it is, the actual subject matter. But the way to actually reveal that to the audience, to the people that are watching it, which is not always so obvious, is you have to find a way to summarize like what they're doing, even in their own reference frame of reference, and which they don't admit to, but which you can keenly map and monitor, and you are reporting that constantly. And as you are consistent in reporting that, what it is that they are doing, that creates experiences, that creates reality checks in some sense. And when you create those reality checks, it does get more dangerous, because then they will escalate further. They will be more desperate. They will be more hysterical. They'll leverage things in a worse sort of way, and they will make worse accusations against you. And you have to be ready for that. And you have to be ready to sort of keep the consistent line. Without that trajectory of consistency and coherence, in some sense, the only way that wins out is if essentially you keep on repeating essentially, why it is that what they're doing is dishonest, is intellectually dishonest from the start, and then you can keep on showing how it's just how they're just expressing a new facet of the same intellectual dishonesty, and you are just keep on repeating how the conceptualization of things, and even how they say, is representative of yet more of their dishonesty, more of the same intellectual dishonesty. So I mean, you can say this as why do your political voices always speak as if you know why everything happens. You know why everyone did what they did. You can read someone's mind. You can read someone's heart. You can, and all of those readings attach to identitarian generalizations and identity politics, or um, uh, why when you read those things uh, uh, they attach to a whole group of people and a whole category of people. Why does that happen, and how is it useful? But I mean, like, you know, and then you realize, how many tractors have you given away? How many farms have you given the same tractor to? Like, so that we can't. We're not allowed to see, the kind of corruption that happens, that you orchestrate, because it's not of the kind that you complain about, because the kind that you complain about is all about groups, and you are on the side of the right group, and you're trying to attack the right group, but your kind of corruption, you know, you have no account of it, you have no explanation of it. So if you were in power, that's what we have to look forward to, I guess, is that you will go after the kind of corruption that you're always talking about, and the kind of corruption that, okay, that's not even close. But I mean, generally, the best thing is to, the reason why what I'm saying now isn't working, and that was also a horrible example of what I was even trying to explore, is that you have to learn how to comment on what they say. You have to learn how to respond or react to what they say, in some sense. You have to learn how to interpret what they say, and work out how you can effectively explain how everything that they say is part of the same intellectual dishonesty, in essence, and how it supports a corrupt um, a corrupt political culture, and a dishonest political culture that facilitates corruption. How it is corruption, how it is moral corruption. You can even say that. I mean, I would generally just all equate it to, can you not see the moral corruption in this? The moral corruption in how what you were saying is a form of moral corruption, and now, and you just cycle through all these different facets of moral corruption. And we cannot have a state that runs on moral corruption, because if moral corruption is tolerated within the political arena, then we'll never be able to stop unaccountable politics, which is why we have unaccountable politicians and and why we have a politically unaccountable government, is because of this moral corruption and this political theory and this political ideology, which is poison, and it betrays non-racialism in the Constitution, and that is, in effect, from my opinion, why this country deserves the fate that it currently sits in, because no one has championed no one has risen up against this moral corruption. They have complained about it in such a meek sort of way, and yes, the optics looks bad because of the aggressiveness of the proponents of this corruption, essentially, because of the simplicity of it. Um, but frankly, that's not good enough. And in some sense, the culture is getting what it deserves, because it's drunk on this disgusting bullshit. In the same way that borderline personality disordered people are drunk on their own dishonesty, um, and they're drunk on their own manipulation. And in some sense, yes, their own manipulation of the facts does, in some sense, they have to emulate the emotions of that manipulation itself. They have to go through, their um, the interesting thing about borderline personality disorder is that, sorry, let me just find this point, because I made a note about it. Yeah, that the thing that makes it difficult to confront is because their manipulation is deployed through the vector of negative emotion. Their internal negative emotions are how they get to manipulate other people. Because they're experiencing something bad, they can use that internal feeling as a way to force other people to comply and to be coerced and to have to attend and cater to and pander to their internal reality, in some sense. So they can get away with having a cherry-picked relativistic hologram of reality and projection onto reality, because their feelings are just so important, right? So and they can't stop experiencing their feelings. Their feelings are their true feelings, and so you can't tell someone that their feelings are wrong, because that's what they are in some sense, and you can't sort of say, no, the reason why your feelings are delusional, frankly, and inappropriate, and even if you truly had them, then go home and actually get on top of your emotions. But they say that they can't, because they're always in a kind of emergency state of emergency, a kind of hysterical um, racialist emergency that needs to be always knee jerk, justifying anything. It doesn't matter how sloppy it is. It doesn't matter how ineffective it is, because it's always just the knee jerk reaction to this internal emergency of negative feeling or something like that. Which is why half the propaganda is the self-sympathizing negative feeling cultivation within the population, which is ironically also generated usually by very specious frameworks of narrative in essence, which have nothing to do with solving the problem. They just have to do with escalating the emergency aspect so that they can get away with their dishonesty. But yeah, so the thing that's important here is that the negative emotion or emotions themselves, I mean, this is just a general point, but emotions themselves are only generated by beliefs. And they are essentially therefore, if they can just stay on the motion and not have to justify the emotion or substantiate it or reason through the emotion. So this is why they always have this very brittle sort of rhetoric, like we don't have to think about it anymore. We're done thinking about it. Our feelings are good enough. Our feelings are the heuristic to guide the revolution, to guide the radical action. And as we just get drunk on our feelings, and we sort of embrace our raw feelings, that they will be the guide to reality, and they will illuminate. They have this weird kind of fascist poetry and shit like that. Um, that kind of bullshit. But and obviously it's invested into the collective group experience, which is essentially generated by these spin doctors in the narrative, and this idea of essentially identitarian cannibalism, that you can attack the other identity and bring it down, and therefore you're bringing justice and equilibrium and epistemic injustice and things like that. I mean, the whole epistemic injustice bullshit also falls under the same sort of thing, that it hasn't been thought through properly. It hasn't been substantiated on the level of belief. It's just a kind of bandwagon of the rational alignment that's part of this kind of fascistic consortium of pseudo-intellectualism and the second-rate, sort of brittle rational alignment of all facts and reality to conform with the narrative. But you see, you only get into the narrative if you can just sort of stay at the emotional level. If you actually say no, emotions are caused by beliefs, and essentially then they don't even have curated beliefs that are reasoned. Their beliefs are represented by the narrative, which already has the why in it. So they have no proper understanding of anything. They only have an understanding. They only have a belief in why things are the way they are, which are generated directly from axioms, which essentially are not even stable axioms. They just keep on sort of, they're kind of murky and fuzzy, because they don't have an understanding of how they work together and comparatively how that would work to other systems. They've really just chosen that, no, this must somehow be the most efficient way of doing this. This must be the effective route to redemption and fixing the problem. And even though it's centered around the identity, that's a good, they're not willing to actually understand that that's a bad proxy or something like that. So that the idea of the proxy thing is, like, it is nuanced, and it is actually quite a deep, let's say, critique of their thing. But you don't get that until you can sort of attack the emotional edifice that it's sitting above. as in the emotional edifice sits above the critique that that race is not a viable proxy, is not an appropriate proxy, is in fact an unconstitutional proxy, that is being covered by this emotional uh, disarray and disintegration of reality in essence, because it just completely, it you know it really is a kind of psychological and moral corruption, and it's actually all the corruption that we see is a direct manifestation of this underlying almost metaphysical corruption, in that the philosophy is junk, the philosophy is garbage. It's never been reasoned through. It's always been confected. That they just, in fact, they even do this in philosophy lectures. They just tell you a basic story. They're like, okay, look, we haven't reasoned it out fully, but like obviously we should just define this as being social injustice, and then we'll continue from there. Obviously, we know that there's something evil about that, so we'll just know that it's problematic. We're not going to define exactly how and why. We'll just know that we'll just feel why it should be problematic, and that supplants understanding. And so because they don't have a coherent understanding that any of this is based on, essentially, that then they've fudged the intellectual fraud, and they can keep it going forever, and then they can just sort of keep on demanding the sympathetic intellectual alignment with it and the secondary rationality. But in some sense, this kind of pseudo intellectualism has existed forever throughout academia. Scientism, these people who think that logic is everything and rationality is everything. Uh, you know, um, I've given the example that I've gone into a bit of rationality rules. He has the exact same mentality. He has the exact same. Um, uh, when I explained essentially how that's a histrionic personality, essentially, that's found an intellectual conduit. Obviously, that's not the same ideology as identity politics, but you can tell that his thinking is compatible in principle with it. But he's got a standalone version of it that works for him as a person within the kind of the cult of his rationality heuristics or whatever, and it actually functions in exactly the same formulaic way, but it pertains um, to different categorizations. But in some sense, rationality rules is exactly like an SJW and exactly like a fascist politician, but he just does it in the content, or in a different intellectual version, in a different subject matter, in a different field of description. And in some sense, his is more esoteric because, I guess it's about determinism instead of about fatalism in some sense. But his determinism is described according to, a kind of a slightly more sophisticated internal mechanism, but he still has the same sort of um, dishonesty and the many faces and stuff like that. Um, okay, I understand that now. I'm really enlarging the subject and broadening it, and it is probably becoming less and less useful to listen to. But at least it gives you the general shape of what's going on. So I think at least I've described that in some depth, even though it's not that useful. But I'm trying to create a better way of disseminating how to confront and take on these things. Um, Sadly, it seems that it is difficult to do so without a kind of just a deep rooted, grounded psychological appreciation of, or at least to understand how these pathological ways of thinking are structured, and how essentially they entrench a kind of immaturity, a kind of uh, and a very brittle form of sort of cognitive dissonance that gets projected and exteriorized and laden onto some iconic scapegoat. Um, and I mean, I think and in the same, okay, and this, I'm just going to make one more reference. So, and then in rationality rules you can see this, that what, oh, yeah, this is only going to make sense if you listen to my other recordings, which I don't expect everyone to do. But anyway, this is an important point that I've been wanting to raise. You understand that what the SJWs and similarly to rationality rules, that what they are doing is not about the world. It's not about truth. It's not about reality. It's not about how things function, or how they can be made better. It's nothing about anything practical or pragmatic. They are, in some sense, actually quite allergic to pragmatism, but they have to counterfeit pragmatism. So that makes them quite dangerous as well. But you can actually see it if you watch their exchanges. If you watch the debate with rationality rules and Stefan Molyneux, you just watch the facial expressions of rationality rules. You're looking at someone who is really, you can tell the level of projection that he's, you know, you can see it expressed on his face, how much he's projecting onto Stefan Molyneux. And you can see how insulated it is. And you can see that a lot of how he engages with people is not about the substance. It's about him. It's about his personal structure of his internal thing. But it has to counterfeit the substance. It has to find targets to absorb his sadistically edged decompartmentalization, so that he can go through, so, so that he can play the whack-a-mole, so that he can use the different masks, so that he can use the different forms of intellectual dishonesty, because it revivifies the structure of his intellectual dishonesty. It allows him to articulate it. So he has to find people to essentially dunk on, to hound, to decompose, to sort of steal their lifeblood as like a vampire, to sort of parasitically leech their vitality and their creativity, or in their sort of good faith. So he has to find a way to sort of dissipate other people's intellectual good faith, because without that kind of without that kind of friction, in the same way that the Nazis had to continually, even while they were winning the war, have like their little book burning rituals, and that's what I'm talking about. That's the only way to sustain it psychologically within themselves, is they have to find um, scapegoats essentially. Um, and it's interesting that it's not about the subject matter; it's about them, and how the subject matter, how they have a special connection to that subject matter. And in some sense, it really has to do with this is more in the other lecture, or the other recording that I made here, is that it has to do with the symmetry between the fabrication or the dishonesty or the internal fraud, between losing the integrity of the inner child, losing the fidelity of the structure of belief, that you're saying, I don't care about making an understanding that's coherent. It's about giving up a coherent understanding of your own beliefs, and you're not interested in curating your own beliefs. You're not interested in doing any work in actually making your beliefs structured and holistic and together and systematized, that you're not willing to contend that, or to conserve that, or to build that, or to um, cultivate that within yourself, that you're willing to give that into sort of chaos. And then it's covered, that internal dishonesty can only be covered up, and usually that manifests as semantic confusion, because that's how words just keep continually get redefined. And then you rely on the emotion instead of relying on the belief, because your beliefs essentially are just are fudged. They're loose bags of jumbled words, and you know that some words are associated with other words, but there's no clear delineation. There's no clear understanding of how they actually interrelate. So it's kind of in flux. It's in this sort of flux, and how that flux essentially manifests as is it can only be compensated by the moral certitude that is conferred by a kind of cosmic rationalism, or a cosmic fatalism, or determinism, or some mythology about cosmic justice, or some kind of veiled truth matrix, where the truth is this invisible matrix, and you can't know the character of the truth, but you know that it's imposing this matrix. And so you're extracting a matrix of truth from a veiled, sorry, you're extracting a matrix from a veiled truth, or or you're projecting a matrix onto the veiled truth, but the truth is fundamentally it's beyond you. So you've already sort of given up. You've already sort of said, okay, well, we're actually, we are ruled over by the God of the world, and the God of the world is not known to us, but its power is known to us, and we must just get in line, and we must just be in alignment with this invisible power. And so their God is the God of the world, and you can't help but be a piece of its story, you know. Um, and just by the way, the God of the world is the scriptural phrase that is actually used to denote the devil, or the spirit of man, or Satan. The God of the world is not the God of the earth and the kingdom of heaven and such. But anyway, that's a completely different sort of esoteric line of discussion. I actually see the Christian doctrine as a secular philosophy of epistemology. Um, and I mean, there are ways of acquiring it through secular philosophy. Vasti Ruot's paper on living with nihilism, or chapter in the book, is very good, and I would say that combined with sort of epistemic agency by Catherine Elgin, although sadly I think epistemic responsibilism has been dirtied by its association with this epistemic injustice phenomena, which you know, I don't think is justifiable, because it's funny that you can talk about it intelligently, and it does sort of, you can create a model of it in some sense, but the model is unactionable. You cannot know that you're working on behalf of that model. It's impossible, because it already summarized it. You can only do it if you're looking at the world through the eyes of a collective, which is not possible. You know, so it can only be emulated or simulated through the paradigm of knowledge communities in some sense. And in some sense, when you start taking moral philosophy into that realm, I think you've already sort of lost the plot. You've actually already kind of found a heuristic to displace something like the categorical imperative from Kant. You've actually fundamentally dehumanized the categorical imperative, and you've replaced it with actually a form of epistemic conduciveness or reliabilism. And to me, I'm quite astounded that Catherine Elgin herself has not been more sensitive to that kind of depravity, as it were, or perversion. But anyway, that's all I have to say on that matter. Okay, now I've really extended my talking, but that's it. I want to attend to an ancillary issue that I have sort of created for myself in seemingly conflating borderline and histrionic presentations and behaviors. And I believe this is because essentially histrionic presentation is actually a subcomponent of borderline behavior. Like, in essence, when a borderline is stabilized, perhaps in a house of mirrors, although it's much more based in a kind of codependent sort of uh, uh, it's weird, because in some sense borderlines are seeking to become histrionic by merging themselves with a codependent consort, or consort with a host, but through the amalgamated consortium. And so they are trying to do this constantly. They are trying to tether themselves to external entities that can supply this in some sense. Now, in some sense, the identity politics itself, in a pure philosophical sense or in a pure ideological sense, if you just look at it abstractly in terms of not looking at its adherence, but just looking at how it functions, I would call it borderline, because it can do the kinds of maneuvering and manipulation and dissolution of reality and weird kinds of selectively tailoring reality to conform to it. It doesn't care about its own self-consistency. It can radically revise itself and radically sort of go a new direction. And it gets away with this because the adherents will buy anything in some sense. So in some sense, the histrionic, I think that the adherents are in some sense histrionic. The adherents to identity politics, they believe in the ideology, so they have a kind of conceptual link to the borderline freedom in some sense, the borderline freedom to just completely push the reset button and start a new narrative in some sense like that. And that innate power lets them think that their ideology is like the divine spiritual pinnacle of human consciousness or something like that, that it is like the core of how psychology works, or it's the core of how humanity should run, or something like that. Sorry, I'm not rounding off all these ideas perfectly because I just want to get through all the structures. So the thing is that in some sense, how the ideology manifests in a particular time and place, it was deployed obviously by the Nazis in their particular, narrative setup and their narrative mythology, and now it's being deployed in this time in a slightly different, attaching itself to different sort of emblems of epistemic conduciveness or reliabilism, different tokens of authority and different, signposts, the historical credentials and things like that, all to get into this confected, sort of collective identitarian lived experience and worldview and such. But anyway, so essentially what's happening is that the histrionic adherent, and perhaps this is true of histrionics as well, but they don't often perhaps I don't know how often they admit this to themselves in their internal thinking. It might pretty much, like histrionics, I think, are capable of sometimes even transitioning into normal functioning. Histrionics can, in some sense, if they have a stable enough cultural environment, if their culture um, is policed to the extent to which that you can't get away with the kind of histrionic manipulation, and the intellectual culture is so well developed that you don't have space for the secondary intellectual fraud and dishonesty and the pseudo-intellectualism that histrionic sort of feeds off of. If there's no space for it, in some sense they can just kind of force themselves to normalize, and then this internal motivation and such kind of gets almost, through the process of cognitive behavior therapy, it just kind of falls out of use in some sense. And maybe it just kind of lingers as an unconscious sort of problem that never gets attended to or something like that. So that in some sense, they still have the propensity to be histrionic. They're not choosing not to, it's just kind of been conditioned out of them. That the general health of the environment has kind of confined them, has enough vigilance built into the societal culture to look over the individual and stop them from developing these pathological forms of dishonesty and such. Which is essentially what was happening when in psychiatry, when people would essentially get the woman with borderline personality disorder and sequester them from the general population and get them out of infecting people with their manipulation and tactics. Um, Obviously we've moved on from that, so the only cure is I believe that if we don't want the society to be taken over by these values and this form of depraved thinking as a kind of mind virus, we're going to have to understand it and be vigilant over it again in some sense. But in some sense I think this is a kind of natural cyclical thing within culture, because if its antidote is not precipitated, then there's nothing stopping it. In some sense, if nothing stands up to suppress borderline values and these sorts of things, they by default will take over. So in some sense, the exception to the rule, and this is why the West has generally been more politically developed than other parts of the world, is because they have actively been suppressing borderline manipulation for a long time. And traditional societies had different ways of doing that. Generally, it was through sexism, through the stereotype of sexism, because then at least, because borderline generally manifests at a higher rate in the female population. So if you have stereotypes against women in general, then at least you have a kind of way to confine it from spreading. Because then if you come across a male borderline, you can be like, don't be like a woman, you reason like a woman. So that's a crude way of suppressing borderline values. Obviously, as we've moved on, we're going to have to be more nuanced about describing the toxicity, which essentially was unleashed when essentially it was actually starting to get tackled in the 90s by real egalitarian thought. The borderline special privileges that females that were inculcated into the female stereotype were going to be encroached, or were getting encroached upon, and instead now we've had this giant explosion of a kind of overreaction of this quite hypocritical breed of fascist politics in some sense. The hypocrisy of the Nazis. In a new. Okay, anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So anyway, I just want to focus on delineating clearly the histrionic and borderline components. So when I talk about histrionic in some sense is loath to radically change the narrative. Because it's very, because then they have to start again. They have to start in this new social milieu. They have to start in a new social environment. They have to sort of pick up their bags and go to a new place and learn a new trade and learn how to try to sell their quackery in a new thing. They don't want to sell new quackeries. It takes a long time to establish themselves. So they can be chameleons and they can adapt, and they usually do that because essentially they have to adapt. They have to keep on changing because dishonesty will eventually uh, uh, be magnified by its own dysfunction in some sense, and so there'll be people sort of chasing after them, so they have to change it slowly. They have to mix it up and stay ahead of the curve and be a part of those who are kind of attacking those other people who aren't staying ahead of the curve in some sense. That's how they sort of compete amongst each other to some degree, but largely they make peace with each other and they find safe targets of people of goodwill and good faith to kind of scapegoat and to um, extract a kind of because they can only fully actualize their structure, their dishonest structures, when they've got someone who actually has a kind of good faith to attack. Because if you don't, I mean, look, I'm not saying that everyone who attacks anyone intellectually is doing this. I mean, nuance it can be very important, and sometimes disagreements can be very complicated. But I'm just saying, in the case of a histrionic, um, and I mean, you can often see this because it's often obvious in their affectation in some sense. They're not arguing in terms of any kind of objective seriousness in some sense because they care about the underlying beliefs. They have an emotional connection to these beliefs in some sense, and that emotional connection is somewhat confected into their self-portrait, um, which is connected into this kind of larger schema in some sense. I mean, in some sense, I have such a device as well, but I wouldn't call it a self portrait. I would call it a self image, and I care about resolving that image into as detailed enough definition as possible and making it vulnerable and susceptible to to um, to being part of the meta negotiation. It's not as if that self image should not exist. It depends in terms of how accessible is it, how transparent is it, are the roads made of glass, as it were. Um, anyway, that's an aside. Okay. Let me just try and not get so esoteric and just focus in on that. Okay, so the histrionic, in some sense, has many different masks that they switch between, and they don't like being caught between switching between those different masks. In some sense, they see them as practical tools in some sense, and they're part of the same tool set. They're part of the same kit, and that kit, that overarching kit, has a kind of thematic theme in some sense, and they never defend the theme. They don't defend consistency. They don't defend a kind of overarching coherence in a single unitary view. They don't have that kind of single unitary view. They've just collected these very powerful tools that to them thematically go together. And that's why they don't like really getting deep into their own beliefs, because they don't really have beliefs. They just have these very vicious tools that they like deploying on other people and sequestering from them the kind of agitation that allows them to see the need for all their tools and how they sort of fit together in that sort of hodgepodge. And in some sense, the only way that those tools work together is because there's this vague cloud that supports the use of their tools, and their tools can be refined, and they'll replace them with better tools that do the same job in some sense. And there's this kind of this vague idea that they actually do comport together, that they are a kind of natural, necessary collection in some sense. And so, when they switch between their masks, they're not embarrassed about it. They're like, well, obviously now I have to deal with this issue or whatever. And they give some kind of mechanical thing. They don't give a proper overarching defense, because essentially they've lost the thread of responsibility from their beliefs. They haven't delineated clearly how their beliefs are manifesting as this being responsible behavior. So they've already cast responsibility into this web, into this nebulous void in some sense. And so they can play the games that all skeptics play in some sense, but obviously they bind themselves within a particular range. And so they can be like, this is the range of truth, this is the spectrum of validity in some sense, in their view or whatever. And then they'll have some kind of overarching mythology, deterministic, sort of excuse for why it's justifiable in some sense. And that's the secondary intellectual sympathetic economy, as it were, that is the material of perpetuating this kind of fraud, this intellectual fraud. Okay, so I'm saying all of this. So what is histrionic? So histrionic is that kind of situation. Borderline creates bubbles of histrionic cases over. They have multiple bubbles of these things. So they've got a set of, like, they're completely untethered, because in some sense the histrionic, although they're not responsible to their beliefs, they pretend that they are. That's what keeps the spectrum and the range within the cloud vague, the moral certitude. That's what keeps their range of moral certitude, or the area of moral certitude that is covered by this nebulous principle, which doesn't have responsibility. That's why it's almost not even half there. It's like they don't have a cloud; they have a fog in some sense. That sort of gives them their sacred ground to function within. Um, they're not even willing to name the cloud. Really, it's beyond being named. They can't know it fully yet, because human beings can't. They've got some excuse as to why they can't name the cloud, as it were. The cloud is the metaphor for the ego function, um, judging things, and so usually people believe that they're covered by some cloud, and that is how they sort of, because their ego function hasn't been completely developed. It's in the state of I mean, sort of. Cloud. Even if you have a very well-developed personality, you will still develop clouds every now and again. But usually, the point of the clouds is to there'll be mysteries that that you can solve, and you don't need to solve them necessarily, because you don't need to go into that mystery only if it's called for in some sense. So life becomes a series of transient mysteries, which you can get into, but should you? Is it really your responsibility to do so? So navigating the clouds becomes the kind of the end game, at least in my model of self-actualization. But anyway, it's not that the clouds are good or bad, but you do need to have the capability of being able to confront, handle, and dissolve them if you so wish, or at least to get to grips with them, to discern them or whatever. But anyway, sidetrack. So they don't have clouds. They don't believe in clouds. They just have this kind of sacred fog that they inhabit, and you have, and which is actually very restrictive, because that means that essentially they have a very kind of prickly sense of that other people must be commensurate with their style of thinking in some sense. They have to actually have. It's almost pathetic, because it's like they have such a weird kind of technical specifications which they require people to adhere to, or which they would prefer people adhere to, and they're fucking arbitrary. I mean, like, but anyway, they're arbitrary for other structural reasons, which I'm kind of, which are more in terms of how their beliefs themselves aren't fully curated and consolidated into having the ego function. The ego function can't inherit any responsibility, because the beliefs themselves, that are the kind of the deep underlying that are like three links back in the causal correlation chain to the ego function, that has already been sort of left to the dogs, and that's been left behind. Um, and in some sense, this is usually based on some kind of specious, they won't even admit to having it, but in some sense they're afraid of words themselves. They're like, well, what's the point of even using human language to reason through things? We should just like get to the quickest confection that we have, like rationality, and just be good with that. And just, if something is in the image of rationality, it's good, and if it's not, it's bad. They very quickly try to just find a kind of um, epistemic conduciveness, or reliabilism, to sort of mediate their life for them, so that they can just sort of have their emotions locked into that instead. But okay, what I was saying. So the whole point of what I'm trying to get into here is that I'm trying to explain how histrionics. What was I trying to get into? Explain how histrionics, how borderlines create histrionic instances in some sense. Hmm. So borderlines understand histrionics. They understand how histrionics function. Um, how can I say this? I mean, they can't debunk histrionics. Borderlines can't. They don't have a mastery over histrionics. If anything, histrionics are more safe from borderlines in some sense, because histrionics are essentially very triangulated within their own sort of very specialized structure. So they will offer some resilience, but they can also eventually grow into some kind of compatibility if the other person develops a kind of consistent histrionic uh, mask, if the borderline can sort of contain themselves or restrict themselves into a particular kind of histrionic representation. But you see, the thing is that borderlines themselves, although that they can kind of become a different person very quickly, and reset themselves, and sort of push the reset button, and almost become like a newborn histrionic, they don't stick with it. They have very low tolerance for any kind of lack of control. So as soon as they run into any kind of headwind in terms of deploying their manipulation, um, because essentially they're just addicted to essentially creating a special form of histrionic in their victim or in their host. They want their host to kind of become a particular form of histrionic that then is responsive to the borderlines um, deploying of envelopes of their that are kind of like hidden commands and push buttons that work within the histrionic sort of worldview. So they actually need, yeah, this is why borderlines exhaust people, because they force them to become histrionic, and then they expect the histrionic structure that is precipitated to sort of be revised very, very quickly and reset very, very quickly whenever the borderline is not getting joy, is it doesn't get sort of their expectations facilitated, then they just want to change the histrionic sort of the histrionic attachment that they have to their host, the histrionic interface rather. So this is the problem with borderlines: is that borderlines depend on histrionic things. They set up histrionic systems, but then they don't maintain them very well, and therefore it's very problematic. You need authority. You need unchecked authority in order to keep that going, to keep that. You need leverage. You need you need like brute manipulation. You need social, cultural excuses and narratives that cover you. This is why essentially I always, when I explain that, whenever you see a battered woman, it's not always that she is just being the victim of domestic abuse. If that is a persistent sort of thing, I mean, I'm not saying this is true in every case, but this is certainly worth pointing out that many battered women are borderline, and their bruises are their armor in terms of keeping their partner um, captive and subject to their psychological codependency in some sense. It's their way of, because there isn't just abuse going one way in that relationship. There's abuse going both ways. And that is often overlooked by, let's say, the cultural stereotypes, the cultural conventions. And yes, it's very pathological, but you'd find that woman can develop that behavior in their man, can inculcate it. Essentially, that she trained the man to be such an abuser. I know that is going to sound very, but it's important that I bring that up because this is, well, within the context of borderline, it's important that I bring that up because it's important that if psychologists are listening to this, that they should be aware of these sorts of things. And it does also, well, you know, it's an upside as well that in some sense that in the future, if we ever get a handle on borderline and if we can ever sort of really treat borderline properly and we can sort of limit people's exposure to it, that a lot of negative behaviors, a lot of things that obviously people feel ill about and that are bad, that these problems will essentially go away, and that a lot of the pathology that happens, within people in the general population, I think can be traced to personality disorders like borderline. But anyway, that we don't realize the amount of devastation that these women wreak on people's lives, on the lives of their children, on the suffering that is caused essentially because their psychopathy goes undetectable, because essentially it is insulated by their armor, by their the armor of social conventions, which is their bruises, because they can produce bruises on their body through manipulating some you know some conditioned sort of PTSD person who's been exposed to this kind of histrionic inculcation and sort of abuse. I'm not justifying any of this. I mean, in my view, obviously you're not going to be able to stop borderline people from being borderline, but if you educate people culturally enough, maybe they'll seek help, and maybe men that confront these women will just turn the other way. You know, will just turn around and walk away from them and not get trapped by them and not get trapped by these women who create these victim narratives which are unassailable, which become impenetrable, and inculcate this never-ending cycle of, I mean, mediocrity, of just, everything just, you know, they are a scourge on society, in terms of their effects, the kind of the devastation that is wrought on a if you could probably put money on how much an economy is bogged down, how much everything is just sort of slowed down to facilitate this kind of secondary culture. I mean, well, this is true in every aspect. This is true in the intellectual realm. This is true in academia. How much resources is wasted for this mind virus to continue to persist within society. It's unfathomable the amount. I mean, it's probably the majority of energy in society is somehow bent towards this pathological circuitry, and which essentially is kind of like a. Anyway, I mean that might seem excessive to you, but I mean I think because it's not just that it's a misapplication of energy, but that it's a diversion itself. That it creates diversions. It creates narratives to delude people. It creates economies of falsehood that allow unaccountability to reign, and misappropriation. And I mean, I've already gone into the political corruption. Anyway, I'm not trying to blame women. I'm trying to say that borderline is what, we really have to get a handle on it, in terms of public health. We need an actual public health response to this. But I mean, obviously, this is the level of corruption is so wide and so broad. I mean, it has already infected the law in South Africa. It has corrupted. It has caused the betrayal of the Constitution. It has caused journalism to no longer function. I mean, we already live in a kind of Weimar Germany, essentially. Instead of Aryan studies, we have race and gender studies. Okay, I'm just repeating myself from the last recording, so let me not go too much into that. But so hopefully we can get a handle on this stuff. I'm not sure if we will, but hopefully, hopefully we will inoculate ourselves in the future using this experience. Okay, so getting back. So anyway, that's some of the relationship between borderline and histrionic. Yeah, so borderlines are primed to offer histrionic certainty, and in some sense, they actually start off when you first meet a borderline, they seem like very stable histrionics, or it depends on their level of health. This is not always true, but often when they are trying to get their hooks into someone, and they're trying to sort of lure them in, they will pretend to have a kind of competence in some sense. They will actually have a thread of consistency within some histrionic kind of consistency. And then essentially they will stop being consistent and they will start to be more erratic as they expect you to supplement for that consistency. And then essentially they leave you with what they were doing and you have to do it for them instead, in some sense. And so you have to rationalize things because their histrionic equations never functioned in the first place. Their histrionic thing they knew was just a facade, that they're not willing to actually. Borderlines, in fact, are histrionics can be more dishonest about their own unconscious side of the mind, because it is actually more unconscious for a histrionic, whereas borderlines are operating out of their inner child. In that way, borderlines are much closer to being narcissists than histrionics, although obviously they all share very similar tendencies. And the borderline, in some sense, does pretend to be a histrionic, and they essentially have two selves. They have the histrionic self and they have the borderline self. And again, the histrionic self is just there to be retreated from. It's there to be sort of abandoned so that the other person will adopt it and will adopt all of the responsibility that goes with that, and also pick up the accusations of that the histrionic shell that the borderline was sort of using as a vehicle was never functional to begin with. It was kind of like, so you essentially, the other person, the host, gets sold a car that never worked in the first place. So they get sort of sold a second-hand car, or essentially they get told, oh, this car, not sold, let me not say sold, that they get given the second-hand car that was given to them, and then they're told that the car was always theirs and that it's their fault that it doesn't work. That's the kind of borderline transaction in a nutshell. And the tactics of that is okay, and so how that's deployed is through negative emotion. So essentially, the car is so bad off. The car, the wheels don't work. The oil needs changing, and it's and essentially you get this weird sort of, because it is confusing, because it's like, who does the car belong to? Somehow the car belongs to both the host and the borderline, and sort of like, but it's got that one way glass sort of aspect to it, that sort of, it's a reflection. The car is the reflection of the other person's integrity. It's not a reflection of the borderline's integrity, but it's the for the borderline, the car is a representation of reality, and reality belongs to somebody else's accountability. But it's somebody else's responsibility. It's the blame is on someone else for the condition of the car. It's not their job. They are just sort of going along for the ride. And so the borderline has this weird thing where they are complaining about the car, and they're making accusations around the car, and it's somebody else's fault in some sense. And the other person's like, well, why are we even talking about the car? This is your invention. This is your contribution. If there's something wrong with your car, then it's your problem. And so, you know, this is why borderlines are always sort of, they share a subconscious with their victim, with their host, and they have to sort of impose their subconscious content, their emotional content onto other people. They don't have boundaries. They don't respect boundaries, and they're all about slowly degrading those boundaries and getting that car to be owned by the other person. To sort of to park the car in their property. Um, so and have it be adopted by them, or abandoned by the borderline to be inherited um, by the other person's subconscious, and then essentially yeah, and then sometimes they can co-joinly own the car in some sense, if you get into the House of Mirrors aspect, but I'm not going to repeat that. Um, that's kind of their end game, is the House of Mirrors, and in some sense then the car becomes an obvious sort of, the car doesn't metaphor doesn't even apply. The House of Mirrors then supplants all of that, and then the other person becomes fully delusional into the borderline, and becomes complicit in the borderlines um, uh, meta. It's sort of they become completely acclimatized and habituated they actually understand the borderline to a well enough degree that they can essentially not have to deal with the dishonesty of the car itself. They're both in on it. They're both in on the deception, but it's a very invasive, sadistic, one-sided kind of thing, because in fact the only way that they can actually get away with that is if they can find scapegoats external to the codependency. If they can together find people to sort of hurt on the outside, um, or to sort of divert the internal pressure, as it were, to keep the mythology, the internal sort of the mystique of it going in some sense. Um, so yeah, I mean, the borderline is very, very crafty at both being able to overtly manipulate and overtly create messages, and overtly create, sort of enough kind of chaos, and enough kind of the right kind of chaos that is meant to control the other person's behavior, in an overt, crude way, um, And sometimes they deploy things like word association and things like that, like very juvenile forms of like trying to incept people with ideas and to control their behavior that way. And then there's the other button, which is essentially the kind of the internal negative emotion, the display of negative emotion. And in some sense, the display of negative emotion is just applied to the model that they have of the other person's integrity and ethics. And so that's why they often leverage other people's integrity against them in some sense, because it's like the complaint is that you're not you don't have ethics, or you don't have proper integrity, or you're doing something wrong because I can't control you according to my model of you in some sense. And it's quite a stupid juvenile complaint, because in some sense that doesn't even help them get a better model, or their model will never be good enough anyway, in some sense, because it's only used in order to control and to leverage control. And essentially, because they don't have a big enough handle on reality itself, they own they can't actually deploy effective manipulation. Their manipulation is a knee-jerk manipulation, and essentially that's why they often spiral into using negative emotion, because negative emotion is one thing that you don't have to justify in the current culture. You don't have to say, oh, my beliefs are causing me emotional discomfort, please find a way to assuage them, please find a way to remedy it. um, because if they did have to say that, then it would be nonsensical, because it would be like, well, change your beliefs, or like, well, okay, I can help you now, but fix your beliefs, or something like that. um, so that we don't keep on having this recurring issue, and then we can sort of move on. It's not as if you don't attend to people's negative emotions. It's that if they keep on having the same negative emotions that are being caused in the same pattern, that's obviously significant of a structural problem in their belief system, in some sense. And then to the extent there are lots of people that have structural problems in their belief, and they're not capable of transparency because they've got a level of sort of histrionic cognitive dissonance in some sense. Um, so essentially, a borderline is a kind of active chaos of agent of chaos. So, I mean, what a borderline actually is, in some sense, is that they were born into a chaotic situation. In some sense, they're born into a world of histrionics, and they can see that there's a level of manipulation happening. And instead of trying to sort of contend against it or confront it, or at least to sort of cope with it, but not sort of um, replicate that kind of dysfunction, they kind of see it as dysfunctional, and then they kind of game it. They try to sort of say, well, I'm actually going to use this as a vector of control. I'm going to use this as a way to gain more power and to make my life easier, or something like that. So they just kind of they went with it and not against it in some sense. They agreed with the deception. They saw through it and they went with it. So this often, I think, happens for precocious individuals, children that are exposed to it, and then they essentially get the idea to sort of go to use its power in some sense. Or the trauma version would be that they were hurt by it and then they wanted to control it, or they so instead of essentially trying to find a way to confront the chaos, they become an agent of chaos to create a game that mimics essentially handling it in some sense. But the game itself has so much secondary dishonesty attached to it that it's its own sort of never-ending cycle of self-delusion and self-deception. So, what's my point? What was I just saying? So, borderlines become an agent of chaos. Yeah, so I mean, they've chosen to become this agent of chaos. It's more complicated than that. I mean, the elaboration is slightly more complicated, but at the core, that's what they are. They know that they're dealing in dishonesty in some sense, but in some sense, their emotions give them the cover. They can be bold. They can perform this right in your face, because as long as that they're crying when they're doing it, That's their trump card in some sense, that their negative emotion should be able they should be able to leverage that to get away with anything. They should be able to leverage that to impose their narrative and to impose compliance with that narrative from someone. They should be able to induce coercion and manipulation with that mechanism. So what? So they are an agent of chaos, and that agent of chaos operates as its core commodity, as the source of its power, is its own internal negative emotion. That's what you have to understand about borderlines. Histrionics don't have that level of defense, or that prime lever. Histrionics only have the kind of the intellectual sophistry on the other end, whereas borderlines can have both. Borderlines can use both. They can use the intellectual sophistry to some degree, although it looks very bad sometimes when they do it. Okay, well, in some sense, the way that histrionic personality disorder, what I'm describing is not conventionally what has been called histrionic personality disorder, because generally what people would call histrionic would be what I would call man, I have to think about this. So when I call someone a cerebral histrionic, maybe someone would just say they have a slight narcissistic style or a slight narcissistic tendency or something like that. Um, and that might actually be an alternative, valid, sort of conception in some sense. Anyway, but it's not great either. Um, but essentially, when I'm saying that about, okay, so what I call a cerebral histrionic would probably go undetected by personality disorder. It would not be labeled histrionic personality disorder. It would just it would kind of be normal enough in some sense. It would maybe just be called, some kind of thematic cognitive dissonance, perhaps, or something. I don't know. Um, yeah, so generally, I think what people used to label as histrionic personality disorder, and then it has kind of fallen away. People have stopped sort of using it. Is the kind of is a consistent vector. Uh, hmm, Let me think. So I'm slightly losing the plot now because I'm trying to imagine. So in some sense, someone would just be labeled histrionic because essentially, in my mind, they would be indistinguishable from borderline, except that they would have a consecutive or sequitur, consistent social personality. They wouldn't push the reset button on their personality, essentially. Um, they wouldn't try, they wouldn't use that tactic to get out of a bind, to get out of a sort of a sticky situation. That um, they have a level of consistency which essentially comes from the fact that they don't have a seat of consciousness in their inner child, in their unconscious side of the mind. And so because their unconscious side of the mind is sort of bound by an emotional narrative that the histrionic is involved in, um, they can change that emotional narrative, but it needs time to adapt or evolve, or it needs to segue into the change. It can't just change on a dime. It can't just completely invert itself and pop in and out of existence as a different character. It can't just instantly reinvent itself by its own say so. Borderlines can reinvent themselves on their own say so. And in some sense, okay, to be very complicated, histrionics can appear to be very volatile,
But that volatility is not a reinvention in some sense, because in some sense they're actually quite, like, if you dig into them to some level, if you go into their layers of complexity, or at least in terms of how they're defending something intellectually perhaps, or how they're reasoning things, they will often show you a kind of sophisticated reasoning, which is very interesting because it's the kind of it's the kind of rationality, the brittle rationality, that allows them. It's very ironic because, in some sense, they will often complain about other people and force other people to sort of to absorb their emotional volatility and their aggression, and through their intellectual espousing, or through their intellectual modeling, or whatever, or through how they see the situation and their very brittle form of reasoning. And they'll expose people to that kind of, what I would call it, intellectual trickery or slight dishonesty, or it's very clunky and crude, and it's, in some sense, when it's not an open discussion anymore. They put a lot of heat into it, and then they tell you that you're putting a lot of heat into it because you're defending against their position, because they're so self-invested into the position in some sense. But, oh my word, what I'm trying to actually say is their their deployment of that reasoning, in some sense, is a very good miniature metaphor of their uh, of their fragmented thinking, and how their thinking is amenable to having this kind of chameleon thing. It because it's very sort of based on the zeitgeist. It's very sort of it takes and it's very fast and loose with itself. It's very inconsistent, conceptually. It is a kind of cherry picked confection, and then it has to disguise that by putting a kind of like absolute heuristic. This is why they often appeal to authority. I mean, histrionics, I think, are sort of, they appeal to authority in the same way that, like, the House of Mirrors in the Borderline works. So it's just to fill the gaps. So they have these very clear, rational little icons, and then what sort of fills in the gaps is these sorts of these vague appeals to authority to kind of glue it all together. And if you kind of go into any issue and you have them dealing with it, the level of projection that they all complain that you're making mistakes. And it's interesting because when they complain about the mistakes that other people are making, it's a very good metaphor for their general intellectual mistreatment of issues. That's just what I wanted to put out there. That there's a level of kind of projective hypocrisy, which is very interesting, which happens, I think, because of the thematic symmetry between how the beliefs are being mistreated, which are unconscious in a histrionic. They are unconscious in a histrionic, which is how they're able to essentially even go into some of that complexity and not realize how foul they have fallen within their own reasoning that they're deploying against somebody else. It's ironic. Uh, and how badly that they can sort of account for that. They don't. Even if they're caught out, it's somewhat. It's strange how they detangle that, or disentangle that from their self conception. They have a very sort of autistic, immutable sense of themselves, the histrionic, which is actually that kind of, in some sense, that's a good way of summarizing the kind of dishonesty that they're prone to. It's like, I'm the only constant. The histrionic is, by definition, this is a metaphor, is metaphorically, by definition, the only constant in the situation, and their status is the constant in the situation, their social standing, in some sense. And in some sense, you can understand why the borderline, therefore, makes the kinds of accusations that they make against people, because they're trying to manipulate them as if they were histrionic, as if they were trying to hold on to their status. Um, and that's why they kind of make these sort of vague, general narrative Yeah, so it is interesting because I do think that the adherents of identity politics are more histrionic in some sense than they are borderline, but the ideology itself is borderline. And if you ever were confronted by a real borderline, um, you see a lot of similarities, but there are also differences. And so I do think that we are dealing with a whole lot of people who, I mean, they're probably going to be called borderline, but in some sense, I consider them to be hybridized. They've been ideologically hybridized. They've been created by feminism and identity politics, and they're very close to being borderline. They have a kind of borderline power within them because of essentially their intuitive understanding of how the ideology is deployed and functions. But in a technical, pure sense, I would just consider them a kind of a form of histrionic, which is hybridized borderline in some sense, because it's grounded. Like it's grounded in the meanwhile for this stage of history. It's grounded in where the narrative is at, in some sense. So they've kind of got a kind of histrionic theme of consistency that is simulating a borderline uh, uh, that is simulating a borderline metaphysic and belief structure because they are aware of their belief structure. So they act like histrionics in a functional sense, but they have the deeper, more convoluted belief system of the borderline. But at least in the political sense, in terms of their political ideology, so in some sense, in terms of their esoteric spirituality, they are borderlines. But in terms of their um, social politicking, as it were, or how they relate to politics in general, they are histrionic. And they actually consider themselves to be they're very proud of themselves because they're the idea that they can sort of contain themselves within a histrionic container sort of in some sense they believe that they've they've mastered this dark power of that is sort of represented in what base borderline represents and sort of being an agent of chaos and being able to control things using this internal simplification of subject matter and such. And in some sense, how they get away with the problem of detail is that they just outsource it to the collective. They outsource it to the general lived experience. I might not have the proof to argue and substantiate the beliefs, but the histrionic collective does, and so I'm the histrionic part of the puzzle, which in some sense borderlines aren't capable of doing that without changing the image that the puzzle represents. Whereas this hybridized sort of aspect is sort of in the middle in some sense because there's sort of the image is fixed in terms of the vision, the ideological vision, but the means and the rationalization and the alignment of facts with it is kind of like the creative art form, which they can kind of play this semantic jumbling game of, all this word is associated with these other words, and as long as it sort of amounts to the kind of the bottom line that is expected of the kind of confection of the in some sense the best way of depicting this is that their beliefs are so disintegrated, their beliefs are so fragmented, but they are contained by bags. They have these pockets of ideas, and they know that their ideas are associated with one another, but they don't know they're not willing to go through trying to work with it to make an understanding out of it. They don't want to make that vulnerable to a kind of debate about how anything works. They only want the bags to be collected and arranged according to the overarching image of why. And they need an absolute picture of why things should be some way, or why anything should be anticipated or expected. And because they believe that they have that basic picture and they can be guided by that basic picture, they keep the jumbled semantics sort of in flux, but they can also sort of say things that sound true. And that gives them a tremendous sort of dark power, that they can just sort of, they can fabricate reality just by talking about it. But the one thing that they can't do when they have this kind of political culture is that they can't fix complex problems, can't even conceive of them. Somehow the histrionic hero must rise up as the Führer to somehow solve the problems for them. So, it creates a kind of secondary sense of infantilism, or necessitates a kind of paternalism over the whole sort of cosmic justice system or something like that. So that's why it has this very strange kind of, it becomes a kind of secular religion, um, like all totalitarian states, really. Okay, I'm going to stop this recording. I think I sort of blathered on slightly, and I kind of lost the thread slightly in the end as to grounding it into what I was talking about. But I think everything that I've said is roughly important. So I think this is a decent recording.